All right, let's take a journey way back in time to the Vedic period in India. We're talking about a huge stretch from around 1500 to 500 BCE. This is when some of the most foundational sacred texts, the Vedas, were created. Now, if you read this literature, you get this incredible picture of a world where women were, these revered scholars and spiritual equals. But here's the big question. Was that beautiful image the reality for everyone? Or was it just an ideal? That's exactly what we're going to dig into today. The gap between the ideal and the reality. Okay, so first, let's talk about that Vedic ideal. What exactly does it look like? Well, the early Vedic texts paint a picture of a society that really seemed to value women's minds, a place where they could be poets, philosophers, you name it. And these texts don't just talk in vague terms, they give us some absolute superstars. I mean, you have figures like Gargi Vachaknavi. She was a philosopher who, get this, publicly went head-to-head with a famous sage in a debate about the very nature of reality. How amazing is that? Then there's Maitreyi. Her husband offered her a ton of money, and she basically said, no thanks, I'd rather have eternal knowledge. These women weren't just footnotes. They were celebrated as intellectual powerhouses. And this ideal wasn't just reserved for a few famous names. The early texts, like the Rigveda, really show women as key players in society. We're talking about them composing secret hymns, taking part in religious rituals right alongside men, and being really respected figures in their homes and communities. They were active participants, not just bystanders. Okay, but this is where being a good student of history really kicks in, because now we have to pivot. We have to look past the beautiful words on the page and ask a really critical question. Was this amazing, idealized portrait the actual reality for all women? Was it the norm, or was it a beautiful but maybe really rare exception? Did the average woman living back then really have this kind of freedom and respect? This is the core issue we're going to unpack. So to really get to the bottom of this, we need to separate two big ideas. On one hand, you've got what we'll call textual ideals. That's the respected, empowered image you find in the books. But on the other hand, you have the social realities, what life was probably like day to day for most women. And that gap, well, that's where the really interesting story is. So why would there even be a gap? Well, a huge piece of the puzzle is that Vedic society itself was going through a massive transformation. It wasn't just one static thing for 1,000 years. It was changing, and that change is key. And this timeline really helps us visualize it. See that early Vedic period starting around 1500 BCE? That's where a lot of these awesome, idealized stories come from. But then, as we move into the later Vedic period, things start to shift. The evidence really starts to point toward more and more restrictions being placed on women. So how exactly did this gap get wider? What did that actually look like in people's lives? Let's break down the changes in a few key areas. First up, their role in rituals. In the early days, a wife was seen as a true partner in spiritual duties, a sahadarmini, which is just a beautiful concept. She was essential, but later on, the texts suggest a real change. We see more and more limitations, kind of pushing women out of the public spotlight and into a more secondary role. Okay, next up, access to knowledge. I mean, the very fact that we know the names Gargi and Maitreyi tells you that at some point, women's education was a big deal. It was valued. But fast forward to the later period, and that starts to change. The evidence points to more limits on women's education, and that ideal of the female scholar, it just starts to fade away. And finally, let's talk about personal freedom, or autonomy. Early on, the texts suggest women had a pretty significant degree of freedom and respect. But later, well, the trend is pretty clear. More control over women's lives, and new rules popping up that limited their rights, like their ability to own property. So, after looking at all this, what's the big takeaway? It really comes down to this. To understand history, you have to learn to read between the lines. It's never as simple as it seems. And look, making this distinction is so important. For one, it completely challenges any simple story about a golden age for women. History is always more complicated than that. Second, it really drives home that critical difference between what a culture says it believes, its ideology, and what people actually do in practice. And finally, it just gives us a much more realistic, a much more nuanced picture of gender way back in ancient India. And this leaves us with a really powerful question that applies to, well, all of history. Whenever we look at the past, we have to ask ourselves, are we looking at the rule, or are we just looking at the exception? It's something to think about.